going to be hard without the commentary in front of you, but we'll make it work. All right, folks. Sorry that we had so many complications tonight. This thing keeps hitting my on button. So in the last class, we went up through verse 49. And verse 49 is, again, we're in this section of the text where we're looking at how do we achieve these more lasting goals. This was what we meditated on. I'm sorry that some of you weren't able to hear the full meditation. But we can say that the Buddha taught two main goals. One is to get high status, to get a good rebirth. And that's usually the beginning teachings that we engage in. And we've seen many of those in this text so far, how we practice good morality and so on. But the second type of result is called definite goodness, meaning something that is certain to be good, to continue good. If we get a good rebirth, there's no guarantee. We could fall from that state and then we're back, where we started. But if you attain either the state of liberation or enlightenment, then you have this, again, in our text, it was called supreme beatitude, meaning that it's a state that is of well-being that is the ultimate goal. And again, liberation and enlightenment are both in that category, but obviously enlightenment is the main goal that we are aiming for. So in this section, we're looking at how we recollect selflessness, because selflessness or emptiness is what we need to realize in order to accomplish that goal, that is definite goodness. You cannot accomplish it without that wisdom that uproots samsara and removes everything that obscures our minds. So again, I'm not going to revisit this verse a whole lot because we talked about it somewhat last week, but we didn't go through the commentary because I think the commentary just gets too complex. And this is verse 49. It says, "It was declared that form is not the self does not possess form, the self is not seated in form, and form is not seated in the self. Understand the remaining four aggregates as similarly empty." So remember that we have this sort of basis for a person that are what we call the five aggregates. We have the form aggregate, which is the body. The other four, we're just going to lump them together for our discussions and call them mind. So you have body and mind. And if we go investigating, we find that the self, the person that we adhere to so strongly to exist in this concrete, independent way, is not equivalent to any of these. We can't find our bodies to be the self, nor is the self completely other than the body, like absolutely separate from the body. There's an interdependence because everything is a dependent arising. I talked about this a little bit last week, how essentially things depend upon their causes and conditions, they depend upon their parts, but in the subtlest level, they depend upon being merely designated. So this phenomenon that we call the I or the self is a label, a designation we give to this collection of stuff, the aggregates. So we don't find anything that is equivalent to that, or that is, exactly what we mean by that I. Instead, we find simply the basis for that I, none of those parts being equivalent to the I. The I does exist, but it exists in this extremely subtle way. So again, the commentary on this verse just goes into more description about how these various refutations that I mentioned in the verse, form is not the self does not possess form, the self is not seated in form, form is not seated in the self. It's different ways that we could imagine that relationship, but none of them really exist in that way because we don't find this final phenomenon that is the self to exist in the way that it appears, in the way that our mind has been grasping at it. Well, then you might let me read the last part of that. And it says the following verse, which is the one I'm going to read just in a moment, is stated in order to illustrate that the aggregates, which we again are the basis for the self, arise from compatible causes and conditioning factors. This is done through the rejection of the positions that the aggregates have no causes or that they arise from incompatible causes. So we're getting at this idea of everything kind of having its way of arising and coming into existence. This is what we mean by dependent arising, but none of it having its own substantial existence or identity. So in this verse, we essentially are saying, well, the aggregates come into existence in a way that everything that we deal with in our physical world comes into existence, in dependence upon causes and conditions. In that way, again, things do lack any independent existence because they always are dependent upon other factors that precede them, that give rise to them. So this verse says, the aggregates do not arise at random, not from time, not from a primordial substance, from their own essence, from Ishvara, who is this kind of creator God, nor without a cause. So they can't kind of come up with 5 causes that are possibilities. Randomly, things arise just on the basis of who knows what logic, from time, from what's called a primordial substance, which is this belief in the Samkhya's, this ancient Indian tradition. Actually, still does exist to this day, but nonetheless, they said there was a kind of a primordial substance from which everything arose. Nor do they arise from their own essence, kind of being sort of self-established. And they also don't arise from this creator God, from Ishvara. Well, where do they arise from? They arise, as it says here, one should understand that they arise through ignorance, karma, and desire. That's why we have aggregates, is because we created the causes through our past actions, our karma, which were driven by our afflictions, which are rooted in our ignorance. And we know this formula from having examined the Buddha's teachings, previously. So again, I don't know that I need to read this entire section, but we can refute each of these essentially. The fact that they could possibly arise at random, well, that means that anything can arise from anything, right? Randomness isn't an explanation. It doesn't give the logic that we actually see in the world. We know that if we plant zucchini seeds, we get zucchini plants that give rise to zucchinis. You don't just like have this random thing happening where suddenly they arise from petunia seeds or something, and you've got zucchini in your garden where you planted petunias, right? Nor do they arise from time. This is kind of a strange position, and I don't really want to talk about it so much, but I guess there was a school of thought where they thought that time was kind of the creator of things. Now, things do happen over time, but time too doesn't have any sort of substantial identity. It's what we designate to past, present, and future. So the aggregates don't arise that way. This third one of a primordial substance, as I mentioned, the Samkhya's, this ancient Indian school, believes that there's this primordial substance that's called Prakriti. Prakriti is kind of the foundational thing from which everything in the world arises, kind of this soup from which the diversity of phenomena arise. And of course, the problem is that there is a belief in this primordial substance to be kind of an unchanging, permanent phenomenon, but yet we see the way it manifests as being impermanent and changing. So how does that work? There's a lot of these explanations that in Buddhist vision kind of fall flat. Nor do they arise from their own essential nature, kind of meaning on their own, because it would follow they don't depend upon causes and conditions, which again we see in the world. We can prove that through what I just mentioned. When you plant particular seeds, you get particular results. Then finally, there's this Nyaya school, Nyaya, that claims that entities originate from an eternal divine creator called Ishvara. Of course, in our Western world, we have a lot of people that believe in a creator God, right? And I've had some debates with some of my Christian friends about how does this happen? How does God bring into motion the worlds and the beings in the world? And the idea is that, again, from a Buddhist perspective, if we say that there's this sort of eternal, unchanging being called God, how does the world of diversity and causes and conditions come to arise from that type of being? Buddhism is always adhering to this idea of dependence upon causes and conditions. And those causes and conditions depend upon their causes and conditions, and so on. You never have this like initial cause. Even His Holiness the Dalai Lama, when he's talked to these scientists, and they say, oh, well, this is the explanation of how the world formed. It's called the Big Bang Theory. I think I've heard that this is not in favor these days, that they're having other views of this or other ways of looking at the Big Bang Theory. But the idea is that His Holiness would say, well, that's no problem, that there was this initial moment that we could say the process of this world coming into existence, but there's something that came before that. You can't say that that comes from nowhere. How does this moment of time where this process begins in the development of this world come from nothing? This just doesn't make sense in Buddhist terms. Everything that we see, particularly in our physical world, arises from previous causes and conditions. And those again on there is in going back. So the idea here is that you have these various things that are being rebutted. Certainly also the view that things could arise without any causes. That doesn't make any sense, right? Because then you would again have things arising all over the place. Be like, oh my God, where did this come from? Because you didn't create the causes for it. Things don't need a cause. So it says there towards the end of this, it says, if one asks from what the aggregates do originate, the reply is as follows. An undamaged seed covered with earth and fertilized and subsequently moistened with water produces a sprout. In the same way, potent karma, enveloped with ignorance and moistened by desire, brings the sprout of a future existence. Thus, the verse states one should understand that the aggregates arise through ignorance, karma, and desire. So the Buddha laid out very clearly the process of causation by which we have aggregates, by which we have the body. Of course, they do have, we're not saying that it's solely karma and ignorance and desire, because for this body to happen, there is the physical kind of process of the two cells of our parents uniting in the womb of our mother, right? But why does your consciousness connect with that? Why do you end up with the aggregates, not just the body, but the mind and so on of the being that you are? It's through the force of your karma, which is moistened by our desire, which is also enveloped in our ignorance, I think was the term that was used. So again, this is why we're in this, having these aggregates. This is why we exist, is because of these causes and conditions that are not just the physical things, but also the way in which the minds and beings like our own create our own existence in samsara. So that was, again, just the explanation that went through realizing selflessness, kind of recollecting selflessness. We've already touched on this topic of selflessness or emptiness previously. Recall that it is wise to start with viewing this in terms of the I. This is where we have the greatest misconception, that is in terms of its consequences, because we believe the I exists in this real way. Then we get caught up in the world around us. We think there's a real I here, and we seek to satisfy that I, bringing forward what pleases that I and brings happiness to that I, and pushing away those things that cause happiness or suffering and block our happiness. So this is the process that we're involved in, and it all revolves around this I. I think it was Sarah who asked the last time when we were on emptiness some weeks ago, and realizing this kind of undoes it. And it's yes, and when you realize that the I is merely imputed, that it doesn't have anything more than nominal existence, and that it doesn't exist in the way that you've been grasping at it, when you have that very deep experience of realizing emptiness, then you don't invest in all of this, because there's no focal point around which that investment would happen. This belief in this concrete I is what drives the whole show. Now, we believe everything else exists in this way as well. That's one of the other kind of situations we find ourselves in, is we're not just grasping at the I to exist this way. We're grasping at computers and other people and chairs and everything else in our world to exist from their own side independently. So when you get this realization of emptiness through studying, meditating on, eventually realizing emptiness with a very stable mind, you achieve this shift in your perspective completely, to where you no longer have conviction in that I anymore, nor in the way that everything appears to you, in the world around you. It all appears to exist that way, but it doesn't exist that way. And you know this from your wisdom. So the next section that we're going into, another eschewal, remember that word, eschewing the three bonds, or the three fetters they're often called. There are three things in particular that are being highlighted here that can become problematic for our moving in the direction of attaining liberation and enlightenment. And I'll explain those three as we go through this. So to go into this section, Venerable Rendawa in his commentary says, one who is desirous of deliverance from future existences must abandon the causes of birth just mentioned. In other words, if we want to have deliverance, we have to get rid of those causes that were mentioned. It was ignorance, karma, and desire. Desire we can include in that all the other afflictions as well. Desire tends to be singled out often as the main affliction that causes us problems, right? Because that desire goes after what we want, and when we don't get what we want, that desire becomes the cause for our anger, our frustration. So our afflictions that arise in this process, the ignorance that's at the root, and the karma that we create through the force of that, these are what we have to disempower. And how do we do that? It says in verse 51, misunderstanding of ascetic practices, a perverted view of one's being, and doubt, these three, know these as three bonds which block the gate to the city of liberation. So we'll go through the commentary in a minute, but these three are kind of interesting. Makes you wonder. One of them is really quite clear why it's singled out, but the other two might not be as clear until we hear the full explanation. But one of them is the idea that we have this view of sometimes.
Donald, we've lost sound again.
Okay, it's still recording? No, maybe not. Because I don't think it's, no, I don't think it is. Oh, it is recording. Okay, good.
Yeah, I can see you on mine.
All right, everything's fine now? Yes? Do I get a thumbs up? Okay, good. All right. So let's take a look at these three again. The first one that I singled out was this idea of the view of the transitory collection. It's a bunch of words that are essentially talking about how we look at this collection of stuff. Again, the aggregates. And this is transitory, changing. It's not something that is fixed, but we think there's a fixed identity here. We think there's a real I here. And so this is just another name for that level of ignorance, more specifically, the one that is working with this view of an I that I was just referring to. Again, we have that ignorance operative with everything else around us, all our chairs and all this other stuff. But the main ignorance is this view that the real I exists. And on the basis of that, they often say it's viewing the I, and then it's viewing the mine, the sense of a possessor, like that this is mine. And we can see how that plays a strong role in all of our delusions as well, right? You know, our grasping at things as belonging to us. His Holiness Dalai Lama often points out how, like when we see something in the store, like maybe you're going out to look for a beautiful vase to have for your flowers or what have you. And you see it in the store, like, you know, you might go pass by it and you go, that looks pretty good, but let me look around, see what else. And then you go back and you keep looking at it until you make the decision to buy it. Once you have it in your possession, you've paid for it, it is yours, you have a whole different relationship to that, right? If it had fallen off the shelf while you were walking around, somebody else knocked it over, you wouldn't care that much, right? You might say, oh, that would have been nice to buy, but no skin off my back, right? It's not mine. But as soon as it's mine, then it becomes something else that we are relating to in a very different way. So this view of the transitory collection gives rise to the strong sense of this independent I and the mine, the possessor of all these various things in our world, even our own happiness and what have you. The other two that are pointed out are, the second one is also a mistaken view, where we hold various spiritual practices to be a way of liberation that are actually not that at all. You know, and that can happen sometimes. We might get influenced by other spiritual traditions where we think that that is the pathway out of samsara. And so we have essentially wrong information. Third one is doubt. And by doubt, we don't just mean the casual doubt that we all have about the teachings every now and then, about wanting to investigate and say, well, is that right or isn't that right? And trying to resolve our doubt. This is a doubt that becomes a stopping point for us. We can't proceed because it's too pointed. It won't allow us to make a decision one way or the other. Either this is the path or this isn't the path, but I can't decide. Well, obviously we don't go forward then. So the very first one in our text was, well, the first one was called a perverted view of one's being. This language is very antiquated. It's the view of the transitory collection. The second one here was called misunderstanding of ascetic practices, but it can essentially be a bad view of any wrong practices that we think are a true path to liberation, but they aren't. Remember, the Buddha himself tried, as Prince Siddhartha, he tried practicing these ascetic practices, thinking that if you deprive the body of all the food and you end up being this, there are even paintings of the Buddha as like this emaciated being in meditation, that somehow this is a doorway to liberation. And he found that this self-mortification didn't work. Certainly self-indulgence doesn't work. Once more, he emphasizes the middle way, which is not either of those two extremes. Well, again, any spiritual path that believes that these wrong avenues of practice are the way out, is falling in this category. It's a misunderstanding of what practices will actually lead to liberation. And then the third one, again, is doubt, not making a decision one way or the other. So in this, he says, misunderstanding of ascetic practices, or again, which is this view holding to a wrong bad conduct or wrong practices, refers to the belief that moral and ascetic practices which have developed from erroneous philosophical conceptions will provide purification and deliverance, right? This view of the transitory collection, as I'm going to call it, more commonly, well, that's where it says, is the false belief that the 5 closely grasping aggregates either constitute a self or pertain to a self, right? So we grasp at the aggregates as being a self, as having a real identity. And there are different ways that it's taught in different traditions, but this is the final view, the consequence middle way view, that this view of the transitory collection is seeing what is merely labeled as I as being a real I, that there's a real I here. And then again, that becomes a real possessor, a real mine. Doubt is the state of mind in which one is divided in one's attitude toward liberation and the path leading to it. Where we just cannot make up our mind. We're kind of crippled by our doubt. So the 3 bonds are by analogy like obstacles to one's traveling to a desired region, in that they correspond to the conditions of first, not wanting to go, which is the view of the transitory collection, right? I'm happy here, grasping this I as real. I don't really want to go anywhere. Thank you very much. I'll just continue my delusion of thinking I'm going to get happiness in this way. This is the big one we have to overcome, is like come to see that there's no real I here that we're trying to satisfy. And that's a delusion, to keep thinking that you want to continue to do that. So that's not wanting to go. Number 2 is resorting to a wrong path, right? You go the wrong direction. Well, that's if you follow these other practices, ascetic practices, and so on. Number 3 is having doubt with respect to what is in fact the right path. So you have doubt that doesn't allow you to commit fully. You go, well, I hear what the Buddha is saying, but I'm not really sure that that's the way out. I don't really believe that the afflictions and my karma are what's the problem, and blah 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 blah. You can have a lot of doubts about the path. Again, resolving your doubts through study and investigation and hearing teachings and what have you is not a problem. Doubts are a part of our learning process, because we have to move away from the wrong views we have to initially doubting them at least, and then become convinced of how things actually are. If you don't go through a process of doubt, you're probably not investigating things well enough to have a sound foundation for your practice. So because of the false belief in a self due to the view of the transitory collection, one does not wish to attain a liberation where no self is present. Again, we don't really want to leave it because we're quite happy being in the samsara world for some deluded reason. Kind of have to be dragged out of samsara, kicking and screaming. Number 2, believing in the supremacy of erroneous moral and ascetic practices, one relies upon a false path, one which does not lead to liberation. So that's, again, that second one. The third, doubt, in turn, causes one to give rise to skepticism concerning that which is the true path. So we become really skeptical, and we have that doubt that becomes an obstacle. These three attitudes should hence be understood as obstacles that block the gate of the city of liberation and must be abandoned. Of course, then the question arises, well, then, how do I actually abandon these and kind of move forward? This is the next section called practicing the three trainings. One might feel that a person can be led to freedom from these obstacles through relying on others. And that may be our tendency to think, well, save me from these three bonds, these three fetters. I want someone else to kind of remove them for me. Well, the following verse, however, illustrates that in this endeavor, there's no need whatsoever for associating with others, that it rather depends solely upon one's own mind. Now, again, by associating with others, we don't mean that we don't get advice from others and teachings from others and so on. It just means that when it comes down to it, how are these dealt with? How will you remove those? Only through your own mind, coming to some conviction through practicing the process the Buddha taught for attaining liberation and enlightenment, which essentially involves the three higher trainings. Most of you have heard of the three higher trainings. They're the trainings in morality, which we've talked about extensively. I think we even introduced these three earlier in the text. Number 2 is concentration. Number 3 is wisdom. And these are a hierarchy. You need a good foundation in morality before you can really attain stable concentration. By concentration, we mean that the mind abiding single-pointedly on an object. And that's, of course, the state of calm abiding that we ideally want to attain, at least, if not some of these deeper concentrations we talked about earlier in this course. And then on the basis of concentration, you then can develop really penetrating wisdom. You're not going to have the wisdom at the strength you need unless it is together with this concentration. So these are called the three higher trainings because they are not just the training in morality and so on, because they have this higher purpose. They're to help us to achieve liberation and enlightenment. Again, this definite goodness that we're referring to in this section. So the verse that we have for this is verse 52. Liberation depends upon the individual themselves. In this endeavor, there's no need whatsoever to associate with others. Thus, exert yourself in pursuit of the four truths, kind of coming to realize the four noble truths through, the first one was called listening here, but learning is how it's translated in most texts, morality and concentration or jhana. The idea is that he didn't put them in the same order that we normally talk about. Normally we say morality, concentration or jhana, and then listening is equivalent to wisdom, listening or learning. Because you have to learn wisdom, you have to acquire wisdom through listening to the teachings on how to develop the wisdom of emptiness and then eventually incorporating those into your mind. So then in the commentary, Venerable Rendawa says, liberation is nothing other than the deliverance of the mind from the bonds of the mental afflictions, a pursuit which depends upon one's own practice of the method for attaining it. No one else can do this for you. It depends upon your own effort. And since this does not require being accompanied by others, it's exert yourself alone, you work with your own energy, putting it into the path. And it doesn't, as I said, it doesn't mean that you isolate yourself from anyone else. It just means that you realize that you're the one that has to achieve this. No one's going to do this for you. It'd be nice if they could, but unfortunately, that's not how it works. So what is the method for attaining liberation? The scriptures state by abiding in morality, learning, which again we can make equivalent to wisdom, and concentration. Apply yourself earnestly to meditation. So develop the foundation of good morality, which we've talked about extensively in this text, abandoning the 10 non-virtues and so on, following your vows, all of these. Then develop concentration, which again is this mind of calm abiding, and then unite it with the special insight that comes from your learning, the wisdom that you develop. That is the wisdom realizing selflessness, which was just talked about at the beginning of our session tonight. Okay. First, one should abide in the foundation, a moral practice maintained by a mind intent upon deliverance and consisting of any one of the 7 types of pratimoksha vows. the lay vows, the monastic vows for monks, nuns, and so on. Then, after listening to and properly contemplating scriptures that explain the four truths, one should first, with a concentration practice, fixed one pointedly upon their meaning. Secondly, exert oneself in meditation both upon the four truths' relative nature, that is, the aspects of the Four Noble Truths and so forth, and upon their ultimate nature, that is, shunyata, emptiness, which is free from all extremes. So essentially, he's just laying out what our pathway includes. If we talk about those were the one Feder was thinking that it's a wrong path, and that is the actual path. This is the right path. The right path includes these three activities: maintaining good morality, then we study and investigate the Four Noble Truths, develop our concentration, and come to realize them, especially the truth of shunyata. Though, of course, we also realize conventional reality in a more, kind of complete way. We really understand that everything the Buddha taught in the rest of the Four Noble Truths is applicable. This is the process by which we are involved in samsara and by which we can attain nirvana. And then we meditate on emptiness to accomplish that. And if you have all three trainings kind of in place and very powerful, then you're able to do this. It's kind of interesting. One of the analogies that's used for the three higher trainings is if somebody is trying to chop down a tree with an axe. They say that morality is like the strength of the axe person, right? You have to have some strength. You can't be a, 98-pound weakling, and try to chop down a big tree, right? It requires strength, and that's the fortitude we gain through having good morality. Secondly, concentration is like our aim. If you've ever tried to chop down a tree and you're hitting it in a different place each time, you're not going to be able to chop it down, right? Concentration allows you to chop at the same place, in a sense, with our minds. Through being single-pointed, we're always hitting the same place and going deeper and deeper. Well, what is wisdom? Wisdom is the axe, specifically the blade of the axe, right? If you have a very dull axe, if you don't have much wisdom, well, it's not can do much damage to the tree, and it's not going to do much damage to your ignorance if your wisdom isn't sharp. So it does require all three to take down the tree and to, again, uproot the situation that we're in and achieve liberation. So this explanation, Venerable Randawa says, shows that the sole means for attaining liberation is the three precious trainings. The following verse then illustrates that every aspect of discipline is included in these three trainings. So this is verse 53. Train yourself always in superior morality, superior wisdom, and superior concentration. These three trainings include the more than 250 precepts. The 250 number, I think, comes from the amount of precepts that a fully ordained monk has. I think it's even greater for nuns. Some people might look at that and be somewhat feel that that's a negative, but the women who take these vows, I think, see that it's a kind of a positive because they get to accumulate even more virtue by holding even more vows. When we look at our vows, the vows are a means of accomplishing great virtue. They're an important part of our morality, as I pointed out earlier. Our morality starts with, abandoning the 10 non-virtues, but as we take vows, whatever level of vows we're comfortable with, we then gain an ability to engage in even greater moral discipline. So the text then says, the essence of superior morality is the 7 ashuls dedicated to the attainment of nirvana. Because these are, again, probably the 7 different types of pratimoksha vows that we talked about earlier. There is, the 8th is sometimes included. That's those one-day vows. Remember many moons ago, we talked about the one-day vows and the way you practice them in the Mahayana is the 8 Mahayana precepts. As they're set out initially by the Buddha, though, they are the 8th of these pratimoksha vows, but they're only for 24 hours, so they're not considered quite the same. Again, I think you have, for the 7, you have the lay vows, you have 2 that pertain to the novice vows when you first, or not even novice vow, they're pre-vows that you take when you're only taking like 7 vows. In Tibetan, they call it Rabjung, I think. And then you have 2 for the novice and 2 for the fully ordained. So you have this graded process for monks and nuns to be able to take more and more vows as they acclimate themselves to greater and greater discipline. So I think that that's essentially what we mean by superior morality, but again, that would include abandoning the 10 non-virtues as well, that we've spoken of previously. Two, the essence of superior contemplation or concentration is the 4 jhanas as they relate to the arising of the Arya path. Can we attain calm abiding? And then on the basis of that, you can attain these 4 jhanas or concentrations. These are said to be very good platforms for our meditation. But again, I went through the process of doing that previously. I'm not going to talk about them so much again. There's also 4 formless absorptions. Those are much subtler minds and not as useful in terms of our developing the foundation of concentration for realizing emptiness. But nonetheless, it can be useful in giving us greater dexterity with our minds. Then 3, superior wisdom is the realization of the twofold no self nature. What is twofold? It means selflessness of persons, I and other people. That's a level of realization that we start with usually. And then the selflessness of phenomena other than persons. Because we also have to realize that chairs are lack inherent existence and what have you. That's not our main problem, is holding chairs to inherently exist. It's once more the I that thinks that's my chair, and begins to, develop all the delusions around that. So then Venerable Rendawa goes on to say, one should train oneself in their practice continually, in the continual practice of the 3 trainings, because these 3 are the complete and unerring means for the attainment of liberation. Moral discipline ripens the immature being, samadhi or concentration suppresses the mental afflictions, and wisdom in completely eradicating the mental afflictions brings liberation to the mature being. So there's kind of like a weakening of things as we go through this. By engaging in good morality, you weaken things, but in a somewhat superficial way. I mean, you are primarily working on your body, actions of your body, actions of your speech, but also beginning to tame your mind. When you develop concentration, you separate somewhat, kind of just for the moment. You don't separate completely from the afflictions, but you cause them to lessen to a great degree. And then finally, with wisdom, you can then cut the afflictions and get rid of them. So this is the process by which we weaken and eventually eliminate the afflictions that are causing all of our problems in samsara. And then it says, furthermore, the 3 trainings include every form of discipline. This is because the 253 precepts stated in the Pratimoksha scriptures, and he goes into the categories of these, blah, 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 constitute superior morality, and morality in turn includes the 3 trainings. One should therefore train oneself assiduously in their practice. So I guess that the point of this is that if we say, that the 3 levels of trainings include the vows that are taken as part of the foundation, well, then it's kind of including both concentration and wisdom within that, because we need the foundation in order to develop either of those. That's the way I take it. I don't know, Geshe Sopa didn't really seem to say much more than that. But the idea is that we can say that they are summed up, the 3 trainings, in regard to how we practice upholding the Buddha's vows. And when we get to the Bodhisattva vows, which many of you have studied, we know that there it's even emphasized even greater in terms of each of the perfections has secondary vows that are dedicated to the practice of it, including concentration and wisdom. And we get very clearly, stated rules as to how we are to go about accomplishing those. So again, 3 higher trainings are definitely related to the vows and can be said to be encompassed in the vows, all the various precepts that we practice. And the Pratimoksha, which is the first level of vows, the Bodhisattva, and then eventually the Tantric vows. And by the way, before we conclude tonight, I've been asked to talk a little bit about Tantra because of the initiation, the Yamantaka initiation that will be happening at the end of May, beginning of June. I know it's a little ways away, but just want to talk a little bit about that for those of you who might be interested in that. The last point, I think this is, the last point, the 5th point in this section, which again was called, we go back to the beginning of it, if I can. Anyway, I think this was the one about attaining supreme beatitude. I think that was the title that was given to these 5 points. This one says, recollecting bodily circumstances. This is a strange phrase. It essentially means our bodily activities. It means we have to have mindfulness about what we do with our bodies as we go about our lives. This is a part of our morality as well. And by bodies, we would include our speech in that because our speech comes from our bodies, right? It is a product of our bodies, moving our mouth in particular ways and our tongue and what have you, and the words that come out of our mouth. So in this section, there's the introduction to the verse. It says, a condition essential to the practice of the 3 trainings is the observance of recollecting bodily circumstances, which Geshe Sopa said means mindfulness of what you are doing with your body. How are you in the world? We have to have some consciousness, some awareness around this, some mindfulness of it, because we can do a lot of damage with our bodies. We could do a lot of damage with our speech, obviously, too. So verse 54 says, O Lord, meaning again, he's referring to the king and kind of paying him homage to some degree, the king that he wrote this letter to. The Sugata, the Buddha, taught recollection of bodily circumstances as the single way of the path. Apply yourself and observe it earnestly. Losing recollection destroys all dharma. So we just have a short little commentary on this. Again, he says, O Lord is addressed to the king. Recollection of body circumstances is the examination of all circumstances of the body, as in standing, sitting, or the like. The Sugata taught this as being the single way insofar as it is the path which leads easily to the attainment of the ultimate. And I'm not saying that just paying attention to our bodily actions is enough for the path, because that's not going to get you all the way to liberation, but it's kind of how we start our awareness, our mindfulness of things. Venerable Rabina would often talk about how she relates a lot of the initial stages of Buddhist morality to what she heard when she was a young girl, when her parents would tell her, zip your lip and keep your hands to yourself, right? Maybe that was just to get, maybe on the part of Venerable Rabina's mother, was just to get the children to shut up and stop doing things. But, this is good advice in many ways. We let our mouth be open way too much, say a lot of things that we end up regretting that we even, vocalized. And then, of course, our bodies, we're doing things constantly that are probably going to be harmful in the end because we're not so heedful of what we're doing with our bodies. So he says, Venerable Wendawa quotes a sutra that says, monks, the path which purifies all beings, delivers them from misery and sadness, produces the realization of correct dharma, and brings forth nirvana. The path which does all of this is the recollection of bodily circumstances, or again, bodily activities. Since this recollection is of such great importance, one should apply oneself and observe it earnestly. If the loss of this recollection destroys every other dharma, what need is there to speak of the attainment of nirvana, right? I mean, if at this very basic level, we aren't controlling those 2 doors, our body and speech, and how we are in the world, well, then how are we ever going to get to nirvana? This is when we talk about a much deeper control we have to have over our minds and a transformation of our minds. We have to start by just being aware of how we are in the world. Oh, it's interesting, in Master Shantideva's text, The Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, which I'm sure some of you have studied at least parts of, if not the whole text, he talks in, I think it's in chapter 5, I think it is. I think it's 4 or 5. Anyway, he talks about how this is like something we need to be doing constantly, this guarding alertness. I think it's chapter 5 that's got that title. It is essentially about being attentive through 2 factors. Our mindfulness, which is continuing to not forget how we want to be in the world, that we don't want to be putting other beings at harm and doing things that will upset them through our speech and physical actions. But also we need to have this factor of introspection. Introspection, or guarding alertness, is this factor in the corner of our minds, like a spy that checks in to see what we're doing. We use it in meditation a lot because we need to be kind of aware of when we've lost the meditation object, right? But that isn't the only time we use introspection. We use introspection throughout our day to check up and see, am I doing things okay? Am I actually living my life where I'm not causing harm physically and verbally to other beings. And it's a lot. It's paying attention to that throughout our day means being very meticulous in our actions and making sure that word that comes out of our mouth, everything that we do in relation to the people or beings around us is done with some carefulness, some heedfulness. Otherwise, we're just going to create more and more negativity. If we can't begin at that basic level of practice, as was said in our text, how can we expect to attain nirvana? If we're destroying dharmas at the very basic level of how we are physically and verbally in the world. So now we're going to move into another section. So the Supreme Beatitude one was the second section in this overall section that is about practice for both lay people and householders, more specifically around how we attain, greater goals. This last one is kind of nice because it gives us this encouragement to use this human life. Again, we often call this the perfect human rebirth or precious human rebirth, to make sure that this is utilized well, because we don't have this opportunity that frequently, according to what is said. So we have 3 points to this division that is called utilizing the human form fully. The first is the removal of the attachment for the body through contemplating its impermanence and lack of substance. So I want to introduce this section of all 3 of these by reading a little bit from Geshe Sopa's book. I hope some of you have been reading. We're on about page 214 to 215. There's just a short paragraph here. He says, so how do you transform your thinking so that you can use your life properly? Nagarjuna says there are 3 things to do. First, you need to eliminate attachment to your body by thinking about its impermanence and its lack of essence. We become very preoccupied with our bodies. And it's good to have some attention to your body. Don't get me wrong. This is a ship that needs to get us to the other shore, right? We need to actually get there. So if you don't take good care of your body, well, then you won't have a good vessel. It'll have holes in it and you're going to sink before you get to the shore, right? So take care of your body, but with the understanding of its impermanence. That's the section that we're in now. Next, you contemplate the difficulty of attaining again a life of opportunity like the one that you have now. That's kind of giving us that impetus of like, well, I can just get another life like this, and then I'll practice more in that lifetime. Well, there's no guarantee on this. It is quite difficult to achieve. And finally, you meditate on the favorable conditions that you have, in particular, having a spiritual friend, meaning a guru, someone who you follow, whether you're in that position yet, you know that there are beings who hopefully can play that role for you, and the unfavorable conditions that you wish to avoid. So we kind of acknowledge that we have conditions we want to have and conditions we want to avoid, and so we need to put attention into that and really make sure that we take advantage of this life that we have that has so many of those ideal conditions. So first, meditating on this impermanence so that we remove our attachment to the body. Verse 55, life, being susceptible to many harms, is more impermanent than a wind-blown bubble of water. Most wondrous is the leisure of inhaling one breath, having exhaled another, and awakening from sleep. So he's kind of saying, it's miraculous that we even wake up or that we're even able to take another breath. And we don't think this way. We just take this life for granted, right? We don't think about its impermanence, the fact that it's changing constantly, but moreover, there's gross impermanence with this body. This life can come to an end at any time. We all like to think that we're going to be around the rest of today, tomorrow, the weekend, the next week, the rest of this year. And we might even be content beyond this year, thinking we're going to be around. But there's no guarantee that we're even going to be here tomorrow. Every morning when we wake up, we should go, oh, good, I'm still breathing. I've awakened from sleep. Death has not come for me yet, but I have another day, hopefully a full day in this life to use it well. But to recall impermanence constantly, especially again, the fact that the time of our death is absolutely uncertain. We like to think we're going to live to a nice, ripe old age, but many people don't. right? We learned this lesson in the pandemic, right? When many young people died, even people who were fit as a fiddle, had incredible systems because they were athletes who practiced, taking good care of their body with great care, and they succumbed to this virus. So there's no guarantee with any of this stuff. So as the scriptures state, the three states of existence, meaning desire realm, formless realm, again, we've talked about those previously, are impermanent, like an autumn cloud. The birth and death of beings, like watching a drama performance. The passing of a person's life is like lightning in the sky. It goes by ever so quickly, like a waterfall down a steep mountain. It feels like the longer you live, the quicker the water is rushing down the mountain, right? You've got this waterfall going down a steep mountain, and it gets quicker and quicker and quicker. The life of a person is susceptible to many injurious conditions. Externally, one can be harmed by both human and non-human beings, and internally by such things as an imbalance of the body elements and so forth. Thus, life is even more impermanent than a bubble of water that is blown in the wind. Like if you've ever seen, like in waterfalls and stuff, there might be little water bubbles that are on the surface as they're floating around where the water's crashing. And they just disappear, they pop, they don't have any real substance to them. And we had in this commentary, we were pointed out that there are external factors that can cause our death. We have accidents and all kinds of fires and elements that can cause our death. We also have internal factors, imbalances in our own bodies that can cause, our own death. And then one of the things that's often pointed out in addition to those two is that even some of the things that we go to sustain our life can cause our death. I remember when there was that huge scare around organic spinach from California that was, it had, what was that agent that the E. coli, right? And you have E. coli that's, causing the death of people who think that they're eating something really healthy, right? I'm going to eat organic food so that I don't have pesticides and all of this and, only get this type of food, but that food can be contaminated nonetheless, right? So there are things that normally would sustain our lives that can become the cause of our death. The opportunity of exhaling one's breath once it has been inhaled and awakening once more from sleep, that is, that we go on living at all, is indeed a great wonder and a matter of sheer chance. It is said when you're born into this world, you have a karmic conditioning that dictates the length of this life. You kind of have created a body that is a particular constitution, that is a product of your karma. Now, all you can do essentially is shorten that life by doing things that are contrary to having a long life, by not eating well, by having other factors that influence that, putting yourself in more danger, what have you. All of those things can interrupt with what we call your lifespan. But your lifespan is pretty much set. We don't know how long that is. But accidents will get in the way of that. Again, improper habits that cause the deterioration of the body more quickly will get in the way of that. So it's not, sheer chance completely. It's just that we should have this kind of being astounded every day when we wake up, every time we're able to inhale and exhale and take another breath, but not just sit there in this place of awe and wonder. Use this life well. That's the whole point of these meditations, is to really get it that we have to take advantage of this right now because there's no guarantee. Then it goes on to verse 56 saying the following verse is also stated to show that life is impermanent and there is no value in becoming attached to one's body. So verse 56, the body's end is to become dust, to dry up, rot, or finally become filth. Understand it as lacking essence, and by nature as having to undergo destruction, desiccation, putrefaction, or dissection. This is giving us a real kind of beautiful view of the body, right? It's essentially just kind of meat or, some sort of horrible, nasty substance. Again, there are many meditations that focus on this idea to relieve some of our attachment. We begin to see that the body doesn't have any sort of pure nature, that it is fundamentally impure. The Bhagavan declared, monks, the body of one whose time has passed and who has died is burned, cast in the water, or buried beneath the earth by relatives. The sun and wind may dry it up, or it may be eaten by various creatures of the animal birth state. I'm sure many of you know that in Tibet they used to, at least, I don't know if they still use this, sky burial, where they have people who are designated to take the corpses in bits, pieces up to these rock ledges where the vultures will all come. And they leave initially the body where they can peck away at what's more easily withdrawn. Then they even smash the bones and mix them with stuff. I think it's in Geshe Sopa's commentary. He talks about how they keep the head aside till the end because they mix the parts of the brain and stuff with the bone meal and that so that the birds will eat it. It all sounds kind of gruesome, but this is what we're essentially corpses walking around. And we've got this, mind together with the corpses that is very different than when you have a corpse without the mind, but it's essentially the same physical stuff. Right? Nothing changes other than the blood stops pumping and everything. It's just the corpse, that is the body we have right now. So the body may become ashes through burning and cremation, what have you, or may in the end be dried up by the sun and wind. It may finally rot, having been cast into water, or if eaten by other creatures, eventually become filth. Thus, this body is lacking in essence, and one should realize that it possesses the nature of having to undergo destruction by fire, desiccation by sand and wind, putrefaction, or dissection through being torn into many bits by other creatures. Okay. So maybe we stop here if I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm not going to talk much because I just at least want to give some sort of idea for those of you who are curious about what's happening. I don't even recall the Geshe's name, I'm sorry, but he's not a teacher I've encountered before, but I think he was invited through Geshe Sherab, I'm pretty sure, to come and give the Yamantaka empowerment at it starts on, I think it's just 2 days, June 1st and 2nd, but it's over that last weekend, kind of at the tail end of May going into June. The Yamantaka initiation is part of what we call highest yoga tantra. Highest yoga tantra is said to be the supreme method for becoming enlightened as quickly as possible in this very life. But obviously it requires a lot of prerequisites to use it well. So it's not just that, this is coming and I should go do it, and period, because it's this quick path to enlightenment. We should really investigate. One of the main things first is to investigate whether we really feel we have a good grasp on what we call the 3 principal aspects of the path. Renunciation, which is our turning away from samsara and the experiences of that, pleasures of that, and so on, towards liberation. That's the initial stage of the stages of the path. We need to gain that. Secondly, bodhicitta, which we haven't talked about extensively in this course. But bodhicitta is that mind we're meditating on every night when we come together, right? To become a Buddha for the sake of others. So we should be pretty well versed in bodhicitta and the practices that lead to that. Thirdly, we should feel pretty confident in our view of emptiness. Not have a realization of emptiness by any means, but have some comfort with that, especially because tantric practice is done within the sphere of emptiness. What we would call emptiness yoga is the support for the main practice of tantra, which is deity yoga, where you are using, through having been empowered to do this, you are using this sort of archetype of a Buddha to mature your own mind into the state of Buddhahood. It's called the resultant path because we're taking the result of Buddhahood, which is kind of out there in the future, and bringing it into the present moment. It's a very deep meditative practice and does involve quite complex concepts within it. But nonetheless, I believe I'm going to be teaching a course on the tantric grounds and paths for Thupten Norbu Lane in the fall on Thursdays. So there will be an opportunity to at least investigate those teachings. You may not be able to attend them because of things you have going on here, but nonetheless, there are opportunities to study Tantra more, but those are coming after the fact. Another thing that you should know about highest yoga tantra is that it does involve tantric vows. And of course, to take tantric vows, you have to have bodhisattva vows. You can take bodhisattva vows that day as part of the ceremony, but you should be familiar with at least the bodhisattva vows. If you don't feel like you have a good familiarity of those, again, I wouldn't dissuade you from going to the empowerment, but I think you should probably check up and see, because those will be vows that you will have to hold from that day forward until attaining enlightenment. And then tantric vows are given in the same context. The difference between those, of course, is that we cannot study the tantric vows before we take the initiation. So you have to have some confidence that this is really what you want to do, and then begin to investigate the tantric vows once you've taken that initiation. And again, trying to think of what else is worthwhile saying. There was a class that Geshe Sherab held, I think, on Tuesday night with the folks from Tupten Norgaling and any students, who came in for that. That was a Q&A on Yamantaka. And I believe that that will be available on their YouTube page. And you're welcome to go listen to that and see what sorts of questions other people asked. If you have other questions about Tantra, you can direct them to me, but I would encourage you to direct them to Geshe Sherab if you have a strong connection with Geshe Sherab, and seek answers from him in terms of all this. I mean, I'm never feeling like I'm at the level where I can help someone make a decision about Tantra, because that's really a very personal decision. But maybe, again, Geshe Sherab probably has some insight through his practice and training that he might be a much better resource. And he probably knows you better perhaps than I do, and would be able to direct you in that way. Unfortunately, he's not coming back to New Mexico until like the week before that. I think he gets in around the 28th or 29th of May. So he won't be around for a long period of time to sit down and meet with him. But you can certainly contact him by email. And if you, again, just I'm sure most of you have his email. We'll make sure that it gets to him if you do have a question. Again, the ceremony itself, the initiation, is in two parts. The preliminaries the first day, where you are taking the vows and all of that, and they kind of begin the ceremony, and then it is completed the next day. But it said, if you go to the website, it says that there are some additional commitments to this besides just holding the vows. One of them is something that you have to do in our tradition for any highest yoga tantra empowerment, Yamantaka or any of them. And that is, you have to do what's called the 6-session guru yoga practice, which you do, it says you do it 6 times a day, but essentially you do it once in the morning. That counts for your 3, because you repeat some of the things twice after doing it the initial time. So that's 3. And then you have 3 in the evening. And it can be done in an abbreviated way. It's not a whole lot of practice, but it's nice to do the longer practice because it's actually quite rich. The other commitment that comes with this empowerment is to do a Yamantaka sadhana. Sadhana is a practice, a means of accomplishment for that Buddha, where you practice self-generating in the form of Yamantaka and so on. It's quite an extensive practice, but there is both a short version of it and a long version of it. Now, I know in the West, we all go, I'll do the short one. But technically, they say that the short one is actually, you do that once you become familiar with it enough through doing the long practice. But nonetheless, maybe what you would do to fulfill that commitment is that you would do the short practice on the days when you're working and doing things that don't involve, where you don't have much time. And then 1 or 2 days a week on your weekend or a day off, whatever, then you do the longer practice. So you become more familiar with both of them. And I don't know if there are other commitments, but you should check up. When you go to TNL's website, the Buddhist Center, Tupten Norgaling, you will find that these commitments are all listed there. Yamantaka himself, if you want to know more about Yamantaka, I think you can find out a lot on the internet. It's a very wrathful looking dude. He's got these wild horns and buffalo head and all this stuff going on. It's a pretty complex visualization too. I mean, I'm not trying to persuade anybody, but it's a very powerful practice for removing obstacles. And so ideally, it's best to get some recommendation from a guru as to what empowerments you seek, what empowerments you need to take, because they can hopefully guide you in terms of their perception of you through their knowledge, their wisdom. If you don't have that opportunity, then you might have to make the decision on your own. And in that case, again, I would still encourage you to check in with Geshe Sherab or someone who you're comfortable with discussing to see whether this is really a practice you want to do. But know that from that weekend, I think it's even from Saturday, you have to start doing these commitments daily. And you will do them every day for the rest of this life. you know, and if you don't feel like that's a commitment you can take on, then that may be a sticking point for you. But, you know, there are ways to work with these things, as I said, in much briefer things, but even the brief things do take some time. And so you should feel that you've got time and energy to commit to that level of practice. We're at about 7:30 now, so questions on that or anything else I talked about tonight?
I have a couple questions.
Sure, Henry.
I'm afraid to ask them because it'll show how ignorant I am.
Up there.
Oh,
Off the-
So this is about selflessness. Now, I was thinking about a clown. Now, I think that the work of a clown is to help you forget yourself. What do you think?
I think there's probably clowns or even other comedians, sometimes it is to help you to kind of get out of that rigid, strong sense of an I. It's not an analysis per se, but it's a flash of experience, perhaps. Is that what you're feeling?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
I mean, I think they're valuable. And I don't know if Buddhism thinks they're valuable.
I've never heard anyone, any of my teachers put a strong value on that, but I think, I mean, it's interesting because clowns, you know, beings who are playing that role for us, or even kind of masking our own identity sometimes is a doorway to kind of, I would recall when I taught the Kopan course in the November course back in 2015, there was a woman from India who's a very renowned actress there, been in many films, Bollywood films and what have you, all these films, and she asked me about acting, you know, does acting help one or is it an obstacle to realizing emptiness and what have you? And and my feeling is that, and look at Richard Gere, who's really quite close to the Dalai Lama, an actor, that it really helps you kind of let go of this strong sense of an individual identity because you're taking on a whole nother identity every time you're in front of the camera. Right? You're who am I this time? You know, and that's kind of what we need to realize is that there's no fixed person there. And that's kind of under the surface that is the real I, that is this real identity. So I think there's that element too that came to mind when you asked that question. It's not identical to what we mean, you know, with the clowns kind of perhaps bringing us out of that strong sense of I, but it can be a similar experience where we just let go of that for a while because we see that there is nothing fixed there.
Well, I think the Native Americans see the clown that way, don't you?
I don't know much about the way
Oh,
Native
okay.
Americans see the clown.
The other thing I was thinking about was Descartes when he said, cogito ergo sum. I think therefore I am.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? Is that just total deception?
I think therefore I am. Well, if it depends on how strong the I am is. You know, when we say I think, therefore I am, you know, like it's this sense of like I become grounded in the reality that my thinking mind and my experience of things creates for me. That's a false perception of an I, right? If we look at it in a very kind of I merely think, therefore I merely am, you know, then I don't know there's nothing really wrong with that. I'm not sure how, I think Descartes probably meant it a little more in the first vein than the second perhaps, but
No, I don't think so.
maybe not. I don't know. I'm not sure.
They were talking, I mean, it basically came from what is our reality?
What is our, yeah.
And they couldn't find anything about what reality was. Except, you know, because of our limited sense perception.
Yeah.
And he just said, well, I thought, you know, I think therefore I am.
Well, maybe it's quite close to Buddhism then. Maybe that, you know, because really that's what I often say to people when we get into this, you know, detailed investigation of whether there's a real I here. I'll say, but remember, you are still here. You know, you're here thinking, hearing, doing whatever. There's still an I experiencing. And that's in the end, all that's there is this sense of an I, this labeling of an I that is going through these various, you know, experiences. And there's no real I there. So yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
No, that was.
Oh, thank you for those. Those are good questions, Amber. I'll have to look into this Native American perception of the clown.
they have.
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah. I'll have to look into that. Anyone else, anything on either what we talked about tonight or the Yamataka initiation?
Donald, I have a question.
Sure, Eloise.
Do you know whether Geshe-la is planning on doing a commentary to the sadhana after after the initiation?
You know, I would encourage you to write to the folks at TNL on that, just to see what they have in the agenda for Geshe-la to do. I think it could be requested of him and,
Yeah.
you know, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that's happening. I do want to also not forget that David Camito, who's been living in Santa Fe for a while and does teachings occasionally for TNL, that he's doing something on Yamataka as well. I don't remember the dates of that. Do you, Mary Jo?
He did, I don't, one of them has already happened, and it's on YouTube, TNL YouTube,
Mhm.
and then there's another one, I think.
Yeah, I think there is another one,
Maybe early.
So,
week, I think.
but I don't know to what, he's obviously he's not going through the commentary or anything like that, but he's giving some flavor of what Yamataka is about or what have you. So I'd encourage you to look at those too if you're curious, but again, for a commentary on the sadhana, I think that would be wonderful for Geshe-la to give that if he's willing to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just so much, it's difficult to take an initiation and have a sadhana commitment for a long time when you don't have a clue what the sadhana is really about. So the teachings on it is I think really important.
Definitely. And he may say he's not comfortable doing that because it does mean that he's playing a more prominent role in your tantric practice than perhaps what he's comfortable with. But I would really encourage you to ask him and to, put that out there. And there may be plans already for that and that I'm not aware of, but I have not heard that. Anything else? There was one question in here. Do you have to take the bodhisattva vows before tantric empowerments? I think I may have answered that, but yes. What will happen on that Saturday, the first day, is that the geshe who is giving this initiation will administer the bodhisattva vows. And so people will take them as part of the initiation, and then on the basis of that, the tantric vows will be given. So you do have to have those. Again, the bodhisattva vows you can study. They're quite extensive. There's 18 root downfalls that we avoid, 46 secondary that we also try to avoid, or not try to. You make the commitment to avoid, and then you do your best to fulfill that. So those can be studied in advance, and I've taught on them before, but it's quite a lot to study. There is a nice little book that I use called the Bodhisattva Vows. What's his name? Geshe Lama, Dagpo Rinpoche. I think it's Dagpo Rinpoche, Dagpo. If you need help on any of these things, write to me and I'll get you information. But I don't think you can go to the initiation and just take the Bodhisattva vows and then leave. Maybe you could, but you need to contact the folks in Santa Fe to check. Excuse me. Let's do some prayers. We have the dedication list first, so I'm gonna have to clear my throat.
Dedicate the merit created through this teaching for those experiencing obstacles, specifically Stella, Bill, Patty, Alyssa, Laura, Peg A, Maggie A, Robin, Les, Lucille J, and Tate the Cat. We also dedicate for those experiencing illness, specifically Stella, John, Jana, Bill, Patty, Dawn, Mary Jo, Thelma, Ben Anderson, Barnett, Raven Chacon, Rosemary P, Bill C, Robin C, Jane, Janice Baldo, Persine G, Susan L, and Jim, and Joseph, and Alex. We also dedicate for those who have died in the last 49 days, specifically Ian Bobner, Mummy Max, Alice Frank, Virginia, Ellen Winslow A. Spider, the baby dog, Brown Dog, Audrey K, Norm, Ryan Price, the World Kitchen volunteers, Philip Gonzalez and OJ Simpson.
And then we have a request to add brandy for obstacles from Tegan and Alexia. And then Amata has mentioned to me previously that there was a chicken who passed away named Baby Blue, I think was his name. Yes, Amata. And then also Joni is on the illness list, one of the sheep there at the sanctuary.
Joni,
And then Felix for death, who I hadn't actually heard about, I don't believe, perhaps, anyway. Yeah, but she said yes, Baby Boo. Felix is the cat. Oh, that's right, that's the cat of your friend. I'm sorry. It kind of went out of my mind for a second.
and that's
Felix the cat is it for death.
for Jim.
Yes. It's a cute name, but yes. Any other beings that we need to add to the list?
Would you add Jane to the obstacles,
Shane.
please?
Okay.
Jane.
Jane, oh, sorry.
Got
We
it.
heard Shane. I heard Shane. Anyway, Jane. Okay. All right, let's do the dedication prayers again. Sorry, we can't put these on the screen tonight. We're gonna have to figure out what's going on with this computer thing, but we have them in here in the Bumpa that we can do.
We'll begin with the general dedication prayers. Due to
The merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase. Wish fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world. To the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. This teacher and assembly of the children of the victorious ones, Shravakas and Buddhas, victorious Losam, father and sons, along with the lineage masters, all the objects of refuge of the infinite lands, please bestow the virtue and goodness of accomplishing this prayer here and now, holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings through explanation and practice. You wore the armor of patience that is never discouraged. Incomparable venerable Guru, to you I make request. While striving single-pointedly for the sake of the victorious one's teachings, the sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, and for mother living beings, you suddenly departed to peace. What a great loss. Nevertheless, through the undeceiving truth of the blessings of the ocean of the three jewels and the great waves of bodhicitta of the children of the victorious ones, may the smile of reincarnation swiftly beam in glory. Fortunate
Nation, venerable one,
unto you whose kindness exceeds that of all the conquerors, for those wanderers in far-off places, especially the West, mindful of your living concern for us, essentially descending again into a family of the far distant land, we make this request. Ulama, please, please, live long. So again, all those beings that were on the list, as well as all other beings we're holding in our heart, we dedicate for them specifically. And may all beings attain true peace and happiness through what we have done here tonight together. Thank you all. Sorry I kept you here a bit later tonight, but hopefully the information I gave was good for you. Everyone be well. We'll get things fixed by next time, hopefully. Okay. All right. Bye-bye.
Good night, Don.